scripture today comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. A time to search and a time to give up what is lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent, a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. These are the words of God for the people of God.
Oh, John.
John and Charles Wesley perfected what you and I would call small groups or Sunday schools today. Now, when they did it, they were a little more intense than we are. I mean, we might show up and we might bring our Bible and we might have read the lesson. But they met daily and they would ask this one question over and over and over again. How is it with your soul? It's kind of like, how are you today? Oh, I'm fine. Well, no, really, how is it with your soul? If you really try to honestly answer that question, it gets really difficult. But I want you to think of that question as we kind of reflect over this last year. So that, how is it with your soul? Is what you're looking back at your year over. Now, we're going to celebrate a new year in the upcoming week. And I don't know about each of you, but I know my family has been through a lot in the last year. And in years past, it's not like there was a huge event or a lot of huge events. Sometimes it was just stuff that piled up over the course of the year. And I've said to a few of you, and I will say to all of you, my family and I are extremely blessed to have come here to be a part of a living, breathing, loving congregation. There were a lot of possibilities, a lot of places that we could have ended up, and we are just so thankful to be here. But let's look at the year. So if you look at the church calendar and the calendar for the rest of the year, they don't always mesh up very well. For example, the church year begins at Advent. When does the year really begin? Everybody else? January. All right. On a calendar, what day does the week start? Sunday. But when does the week really start? Monday. So y'all are awake a little more than the last crowd. So if we were to look at the calendar year as far as what events go on in the church, the first big event we have is Ash Wednesday and then Lent. After that, we experience the death and resurrection of Jesus through the Holy Week with Tenebrae, Good Friday, and Easter. And after that comes the Pentecost, and then eventually we get to Advent. But that doesn't sound right. We experience death and resurrection before we get to experience the birth. Now, we've just gone through Advent, and through this season, every year we're reminded the Jewish people were looking for a Mashiach, a Messiah, that would ride in with an army and liberate the Jewish people. But instead, they got a tiny, helpless baby. They expected somebody that would restore the people to their former glory, someone who would fight for good Jewish values and customs. But at every turn, this Jesus was subversive. Healing on the Sabbath, forgiving sins, hanging out with the undesirable people, telling the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the scribes and the elders that they had it all wrong. He even allowed himself to be crucified. And upon his death, he tore the curtain to the Holy of Holies. Now, we hear that God's ways are different than ours, And this gives us a glimpse of it, but just how different are God's ways than ours. See, the gospel that Jesus came to share, it goes beyond the little red words in our Bibles. Before Jesus came, people measured their holiness with their deeds, their tithes, even tithing 10% of the herbs they grew in their little windowsill. But Jesus brought a different message. See, the Jewish people had become a society of laws and rules, and they were more worried about doing what was correct in the eyes of the law than doing what was right. He likened them to a cup that was only washed on the outside, or a whitewashed tomb. Jesus came to show us how to live in community with each other and with God, who is our Creator. Jesus lived this gospel of accompaniment, living with, eating with, and even dying with those that society had never even given a chance. In the words of Paul, Jesus showed us a more excellent way. Now this year we've seen a lot of news. But how much good news was there? An inmate on death row died in agony after the drug combinations failed to work as intended. A mudslide in Washington that killed 43 people. A shooting spree at Fort Hood, Texas. An ignition switch recall that has led to multiple deaths over the last 10 years. Deaths of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and the violence that followed. Ebola, ISIS, the Ukraine crisis, Malaysia Flight 17, Israel and Hamas, the kidnapping of 300 young Nigerian girls. All this is bad news. Was there anything good that happened this year? What stories do we remember that were positive? Maybe one or two stories? Now granted, sensational news keeps our attention because it's exactly that, it's sensational. But there was good news. We know it. That might not have been on an international scale, or a national scale, or a statewide scale, or heck, even a Northwest Arkansas scale. But there was good news, right? Wasn't there? Every day there's good news. This summer I got to watch a group of teens build wheelchair ramps and paint houses and help people in need. They didn't just come and build the stuff and leave. I got to watch them have lunch with their neighbors, get to know them, not just as people who needed a wheelchair ramp or needed their house painted, but get to know them as people. And I get to see the excitement as the kids, oh, he was a sheriff when he was young. Or, oh, you got to hear this person's story. It's amazing. They did all this stuff. We begin to see beyond what they need and see them for who they are. I've seen a community of faith rally around one of their own as they battle a terminal disease. I've watched as the homeless are housed, the hungry are fed, the sick are visited, and God is alive and well. Yes, there's good news. Now the word gospel means good news. But we don't seem to spread that much good news these days. It's easier to tear down than to build up. And sometimes the gospel is used not as good news for all, but good news for me and the people like me. But Jesus never worked that way. Just like the calendar, Jesus was upside down. When he talked about the last and the least, he really talked about those who we ignore, deny, or prejudge. Jesus didn't say, treat them as your neighbor. He lived treating them as his neighbor. And he called us to live it as well. Reminds me of a story I learned in United Methodist history. A rather well-to-do lady and John Wesley were corresponding back and forth in letters, and he kept telling her, you have to go and visit the poor. You have to go and visit the orphans. You have to go and do this. And every time she would write back with another excuse. And eventually she says, you know, I just don't know what good it would do having me bring Jesus to the place where the poor people live. And John Wesley responded, "My dear, you don't understand. Jesus is already there. You just need to go watch." How do we live out this good news? How do we step outside our comfort zone? How do we live this gospel? A gospel of accompaniment, a gospel of living with, a gospel of radical inclusion. Let me give you an example of how we can live it out here. Now, I've already told this whole sermon to Dixon, so if anybody says, Jinx says get rid of the food pantry, I'm going to call you a liar. Churches with food pantries have a lot of business. And unfortunately, it's not always under good circumstances that people come to their door. Churches that have a food pantry that are in an urban environment seem to be busier because they're just easier to get to. They're more centers of the community. Now, I'm not saying we get rid of our food pantry. What I'm saying is, what if we did things a little different? We keep the food pantry just like it is, how it is. People donate food. People come get food. That's fine. But what if we as a congregation checked in on our neighbors, our cashiers, our gas station attendants, our baristas, all those people that we come in contact with, and we don't even know their name? What if we asked a simple question? Is there something I can do to help? Our neighbor might say, you know, I really could use some food. And instead of saying, oh, just go down to Elm Springs and tell them, you know, I sent you, they have a food pantry. Instead of sending them here to do that, why don't we come up, get what they need, and then bring it to them and spend time with them. Get to know them. Get to know their story. Get to know them as a person, not just as my cashier. Maybe we find out they're working 2 jobs and just struggling to make ends meet. Maybe we know somebody that can hire them. Maybe we don't. Maybe we know a way they can go back to school. Or maybe we don't. Maybe the important thing is just spending time with them and showing them that we care. See, Jesus met people where they're at, and we can do that too. And this year we lost a lot of notable people. Maya Angelou, Sid Caesar, Oscar de la Renta, James Garner, Casey Kasem, Harold Ramis, Joan Rivers, Mickey Rooney, Shirley Temple, Robin Williams. And I hate to break it to you, just last week we lost Joe Cocker. And this is a small, small list. And these are just the famous people. These are just some of the famous people. It doesn't even mention our friends or our family or our loved ones, people that we care about that have passed on this year. Let me ask you this. How many births have we celebrated this year? Maybe 1 or 2 as individuals. But how many births made news like a celebrity death? None. Well, I hope there's one that we all celebrated as a family. And that's the birth of Christ. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, and I will be up front with you. I stole this story from Lynn Sweet. He spoke at CORE, and with permission, I'm using this. So, the Greek word for Christ, Christos, and the Hebrew word for Messiah, Mashiach, share something in common. They both mean the anointed one. Now, when somebody was anointed in the Scriptures, they used oil. And this oil usually and most often was used for cooking. And we have oil that we used for cooking as well. My grandma used to keep a vat of Crisco above the fridge. And that's what we pretty much knew when we were eating fried chicken, because that wasn't on top of the fridge. How many people here like fried chicken? You got to use Crisco, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Nobody argued with me in the first service either. See, the ancient Hebrews in Jesus' time had 2 kinds of oil. There was the Christos, and there was another oil called pistos. Christos is the way we know of Christ, the anointed one, but Christos oil was actually the oil used by common people for cooking. it was probably animal fat. Common people couldn't afford the expensive oil, the extra virgin olive oil like we have. Maybe when King Herod was anointed, they used this pistos oil to anoint him, but Christ became associated with this poor people's oil, or common people's oil. And just like the ancient Jews, we have a second kind of oil as well, and that's extra virgin olive oil. Has anyone here ever tried to cook fried chicken with extra virgin olive oil? It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? It burns up too fast. It's not suited for high temperatures. Lynn Sweet, when he gave this talk, he says, "Man, I am glad I have a Jesus Christos because a Jesus Pistos couldn't take the heat." How awesome is it that our God always stands with the underdog? That our God is always subversive enough to send a baby instead of a general, a lamb to represent the Lion of Judah. How awesome is it that Jesus, who came to live among the poor, the sick, the battered, the forgotten. How great is it that God said, "Love them as I have loved you." And how awesome is it that we get to represent this Christ today, right here. Not just to one people or another people, but to all people. I'm going to say this, it is awesome. Because we have a God that is full of grace and second chances, and teaches us to do the same for our neighbors. Our God who gave us a free will and the ability to love our neighbor, our God who gives us one more year to deny ourselves and to follow Him. See, the point that I'm trying to make, and I don't know that I quite can, is some days are going to be trials. Some days are going to be death. Some days are going to be resurrections, and other days are going to be birth. But every day is a chance for the Holy Spirit to work. Next year, which is technically next week, or actually this week, we're going to start a new series called Dare to Dream. And this is a chance for us to reimagine our world, to create a sense of urgency where people had rather, be honest, look away. A chance to be the church of Jesus Christ to the people of Elm Springs, Northwest Arkansas, and the world. Now, the class that meets in the chapel will be doing a study by the same name. It's called Dare to Dream. And this is a really great time to invite people to church. To invite them to be more than just a congregation that shows up on Sunday and sits, listens to some beautiful songs and some words that halfway make sense. There you go. It's a chance to be a part of a community. It's a chance to be a part of the hands and feet reaching out to the world and being the body and blood of Christ. I'm going to put this video on our Facebook feed, and you can share it, link it, or even email it to friends and family if you play the video. This will be our new sermon season.